Greetings loves, it is I, Tactical Girlfriend. It's so good to have you back here on the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing the fundamentals of pistol grip and stance. This is a good summation of the subject and should be a good overview for those who are more experienced, as well as a good primer for the newbies in the crowd. So buckle your seatbelts, let's go for a ride. I'm going to talk about stances, but first a disclaimer. Stances are simply a starting point and a guideline. There's no ideal stance, and every shooter is going to have their own personal preferences and experiences with these. My recommendation is that you stay flexible, learn them all, and see what works best for you. There's also a lot of different kinds of stances out there, some designed more for close quarters, such as center axis relock and thumb pectoral index, which I will not be covering today. Alright, so diving in, we're going to go in chronological order here, starting with the Weaver stance. The Weaver stance was developed by Jack Weaver in the 1950s. This was back when people were largely still wielding pistols one-handed. From the ground up, the Weaver stance starts with a non-dominant leg forward, pointed towards the target, knees slightly bent, with the dominant leg about a full step behind it, toes pointed about 45 degrees out. This gives you a more bladed, fighting style stance. Moving up, the support arm is bent and the shooting arm is extended. Both elbows are bent, the shooting arm less so. This is intended to use a push-pull force between the hands on the pistol for better retention. As for the pros of the Weaver stance, it gives you a smaller profile when you're facing the target, it has better front-to-back stability, and feels more like a natural fighting stance. As for the cons of this stance, it impedes torso rotation to the non-dominant side. It also is harder for cross-eye dominant shooters to shoot with. And lastly, your armor does not offer nearly as much protection because you're not squared up at the target, offering the most surface area. The next stance we have on the list is the Chapman or modified Weaver stance. This one is almost identical to the Weaver stance, except for the fact that your shooting sidearm is fully extended. This allows some people, if they wish, to use it as a cheek weld. Also, your shooting side foot can be brought in just a little bit here. As far as the pros of this stance goes, basically all the same as the Weaver, in addition to added consistency and stability through the extended shooting side arm. Also, some cross-eye dominant shooters might find the cheek weld easier to use. As for the cons, again, basically all the same as the Weaver, minus some of the difficulties for cross-eye dominant shooters. Also, this stance can get a bit stiff and might strain your neck muscles. Next up, we have the Isosceles stance. Once again, moving from the ground up, your feet are even, shoulder width apart, toes pointed towards the target with a slight bend in the knees. Your torso faces the target squarely, with both of your arms extended in an isosceles triangle, as the name implies. As for the pros of the isosceles stance, it's a very natural and neutral stance. People tend to face off squarely against their target in defensive situations, so this one's very intuitive. This stance allows your torso to act as a turret, giving you full mobility from left to right. It doesn't favor any particular kind of eye dominance. It gives you good side-to-side stability, and it also maximizes the potential protection from your body armor. As for the cons, it doesn't give you nearly as much front-to-back stability, and if you aren't wearing body armor, it needlessly makes a larger profile out of you. As for me personally, I like to make sure that I'm staying dynamic more than anything. As for the stance that I tend to defer to these days, it's what I would probably otherwise call a modified isosceles. Once again, starting with the feet, this stance is nearly identical to the isosceles stance, except the body assumes a slightly more natural fighting stance. The dominant foot is about half a step behind the non-dominant foot. This assumes a more dynamic and instinctive starting position for most shooters. Between this and isosceles, we'll be focusing primarily on these today. As for what we do with the upper half of our body, we want to make sure, once again, that we're squared off against the target. We want our shoulders forward and our nose over our toes to best give us a head start at mitigating that recoil. Now, when we present our firearm on target, we want to make sure that we're bringing the gun up to our eyes, not the other way around. You don't want to be a tactical turtle. You want to make sure that your shoulders remain clear of your periphery, giving you the best situational awareness, and you want to make sure that you're not needlessly straining your neck muscles. Speaking of eyes, we want to make sure we know what our dominant eye is. In order to do so, simply look at an object that's far away, put your thumb in the thumbs up position, and then simply extend your thumb out to try to cover it. Then close each eye, see which eye has the thumb over the object, and that is your dominant eye. Let's talk about our elbows. At extension, we want to make sure that our elbows are pointed outwards, not downwards. This allows you to get a very good vice grip from side to side on your gun. Also, you want to make sure that your elbows aren't locked, otherwise your wrists become very weak. You want those elbows bent and your wrists locked forward. Moving right along, let's talk about what our hands do. Starting with the dominant hand, take the webbing between your thumb and your index finger and squeeze it as high and tight as possible underneath the beaver tail of the pistol. This will get you as close as possible to the bore axis and thus give you the most control over recoil. What you want to make sure you're doing is not simply grabbing the gun as if it's a cylinder with your thumb resting either at the horizon or below it. you want to try to pinch upward as best as possible to maximize the potential for grip here. As for your non-dominant hand, take your thumb, place it horizontally along the side of the frame as far forward as possible. Then take the palm of that hand and cover up the remaining surface area on the grip on the other side. Wrap your fingers, preferably as far forward as possible, underneath the trigger guard and around the remaining fingers on the grip. Once you have your grip established, you're going to create inward force onto the gun from either side of the hand, squeezing inwards like a vise. The majority of your grip strength should be coming from your non-dominant hand so that your dominant hand is loose enough to operate the trigger smoothly. A little side note here, you might want to invest in certain machines that help you build up your hand strength for a better grip, such as this Captains of Crush resistance trainer. Alright, we're ready to start pulling the trigger. I do go into this in far closer detail in my dry fire video, so I do recommend checking it out if you're interested. The first thing you do as you pull that trigger is hold your breath to steady your shot. At what lung capacity and at what stage of breathing you hold your shot, I think is a very subjective matter, so I do recommend experimenting and seeing what works best for you. As an overview for pulling the trigger, if you are using a 2-stage trigger, you're going to pull back, take up some slack, and eventually hit what we call a wall. That is the harder point of resistance in the trigger. Once we hit that, we just gradually pull back very steadily and slowly until the shot breaks. If you're using a 1-stage trigger, you're going to simply pull back once until it breaks. As for pulling the trigger, you start by putting your finger on the trigger. Where exactly you place your finger on the trigger is very subjective to you, your anatomy, your gun, and your trigger. There's no correct answer here, so I do recommend starting with whatever feels most natural. Once you have your finger on that trigger and you're pulling, track your shots, see exactly where they're landing. If your shots are landing too far to the left, it may be because you're pushing the trigger with your finger as opposed to pulling straight back, thereby pulling the entire gun to the left. If your shots are landing too far to the right, it may be because you have too much finger in that trigger and you're pulling the entire gun and the trigger with it to the right. Make sure you're experimenting with this and adjusting accordingly. Now, as for resetting the trigger to follow up with a subsequent shot, there are 2 very intentional ways to do this. The first is better suited for longer range and slower shooting. This involves keeping the trigger pinned all the way back and slowly releasing it until you feel and/or hear the trigger reset. Once you reach that stage, you can simply pull back to break that wall once again. The second method that I defer to facilitates faster follow-up shots and therefore is better suited for defensive shooting. Once the shot breaks, instead of pinning the trigger all the way back and slowly creeping to the wall, you're going to quickly release it and then squeeze right back into that wall. This method allows for much more rapid and consistent follow-up shots. As for reloading, press down on the magazine release, let your magazine drop free. If it is not a drop-free magazine, manually remove it. As you're doing this, reach for a new magazine and insert it into the mag well. Simultaneously stage your thumb over the slide release. Once the magazine is firmly seated, release the slide. If your pistol does not have a slide release, use your non-dominant hand with an overhand grip on the slide to grab it, pull back, and release it forward. You're ready to keep shooting. Well, that wraps up my little 101 on how to shoot these little pew-pew things that we call pistols. I hope this information was useful to you, whether you're new or if you're just looking for a refresher. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and like, subscribe, and comment. As always, I also want to give a big shout out to everybody on Patreon. I really appreciate your support. If you want to help sustain and grow this project, go to patreon.com/tacticalgf. See the end of the video for the name of my biggest contributors. And that's a wrap. Thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate you all tuning in, and as always, please take care. Bye!